Hello, my name's Paul Merchant and I'm the Global Head of Makeup for Kryolan. Today I want to talk to you about something really important when it comes to makeup artistry, and that's colour theory. Now, this subject can get really confusing and it goes in so many different directions that I thought we could take this opportunity to explain the key points of colour theory that are specifically important when it comes to makeup, and we're going to have a specific focus on cosmetic camouflage. So I'm going to take you through all of the basics that you need to know in understanding colour theory and how you can relate that to your makeup work. The first important thing to mention is that there are different colour systems, and I think this is one of the things that can confuse people. So typically when we're looking at artistry, we're using the RYB system, the red, yellow, blue, and that's typically used by artists. Then you may have heard of systems like CMY or CMYK. That's cyan, magenta, yellow and key being black. These are used for printing. So this is the colour system that's used when it comes to the theory behind colour in print. Then you've got the RGB system, the red, green, blue. Now the RGB system is used digitally. So that's anything that we see on our computers, television, film, they all use the RGB system. So today we're going to be focusing on the RYB, the red, yellow, blue. So everything that I'm talking about throughout this video, we're focusing on that particular colour system. An easy way to remember it is when we're looking at the RYB system, we're talking about the physical presence of colour. So it's something that you can actually touch, like a green apple or your face, makeup product. It's something that you can physically hold. And that's known as the subtractive colour mixing. When we look at the RGB or the CMYK, this is not a physical presence of colour. So it's something like light or reflection, a rainbow, digitally made colours that we see on screens. These are things that we can't actually touch, and that's known as additive colour mixing. So this can be as well the reason why with our human eye, a makeup would look different to us than what it looks like on camera, because the physical way that the colour is mixed in order to recreate that imagery is a different colour mixing system to what we use physically. So there's subtractive colour mixing and additive colour mixing, which you can see on the screen here now. Today we're going to be talking about subtractive colour mixing. Let's start by looking at the fundamental model of the subtractive colour mixing and what it's based upon. And that is the colour wheel, developed to this stage by Sir Isaac Newton in 1666. And the colour wheel is 12 colours or hues that are laid out in a logical process so that it shows the relationship between the colours that are in the wheel. Now, this is a perfect tool for makeup artistry or any kind of artistry because it shows us how the human eye perceives colour. And that's really important when we're talking about the subtractive colour mixing, because this is a guide that can help us in selecting colours that are going to complement, contrast, work together, or cancel each other out. So there's loads of different ways that you can use this colour wheel as a tool that will help you in your artistry. So the colour wheel was laid out fundamentally to explain the relationship between the primary colours and the colours or hues that bridge the gaps between them. So let's break down some of this terminology so that it's easier for us to kind of understand it. First of all, we have colour. Now, colour is defined by three characteristics, and that's hue, value, and intensity. Now, the hue is the name of a pure colour in the colour wheel, made up of the primaries, the secondaries, and the tertiaries. Value is the relative lightness or darkness of a colour, and that's otherwise known as the grayscale, but we'll come to that in a little bit more detail later. Then you've got intensity, which is the brightness or dullness of a colour, so how bright it appears or how dull it appears, and that's known as the intensity. Now, understanding that terminology, we're going to move forward now and go a little bit further into colour theory. Now let's look at the primary, secondary and tertiary colours. So primary colours are the colours, in this case RYB, red, yellow, blue, and they can't be created by mixing other colours together. They're pure colours in their own right. They're the primaries. Then we've got secondary colours. Secondary colours are made when two primary colours are mixed together to create a third colour. So, for example, mixing red and yellow create the orange. These are known as secondary colours. Then there's tertiary colours. Tertiary colours are made when you mix a primary colour with a secondary colour. So they're colours like red-orange and yellow-orange, and together the primary, secondary and tertiary colours make up the 12 colours of our colour wheel. Now let's talk about the relationship of colour and how it sits within the wheel and what that means. First of all, let's talk about complementary colours. Now, complementary colours are sometimes referred to as opposite colours or correcting colours, but we're all talking about the same thing. So these are the colours that when you layer them together, they cancel each other out. So they reduce the intensity of both colour and they actually form a tone on the grayscale. So it's actually correcting tones within each other until they become something that's very muted. And that's really important when it comes to cosmetic camouflage. But we'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a moment. But just remember that the complementary colours, and when we refer to them, are colours when they're mixed together, they cancel each other out. Then we've got analogous colours. Now, analogous colours are a group of 3 colours on the colour wheel, and they always sit next to each other, and they're made up of a primary, a secondary, and a tertiary. Now, in the makeup artistry world, you may hear these referred to as monochromatic, when you've got 3 colours that kind of complement each other and they sit within one section of the colour circle in a period of 3 colours. Now, as makeup artists, we all know that white and black are fundamentally 2 arguably of the most important colours that we use. But as you can see in this current model of the colour wheel, they're not actually physically represented. So this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. Let's imagine the colour wheel as a globe and let's bring it up onto an axis and let's kind of imagine it spinning round. Now we can see these kind of full spectrum of colour. Where is white and black? So this model will help you understand that a little bit more. So if we imagine we have all of our colours spinning around our axis, and at the top we have white and at the bottom we have black. Now we know by mixing white and black you achieve grey. So where's the grey? The grey sits directly in the middle of the colour wheel, and this is our grayscale. You have white at the top, black at the bottom, and a dark grey in the middle. And then as we move up between the black through the grey to the white, this is how we achieve our tint, our tone, and our shades. So let's talk about that in a little bit more depth. We hear these classifications in makeup artistry all the time, but what do they actually mean by definition? So a tint, when we look at the model that we just saw of the grayscale with our colour wheel going around the globe, a tint is when you progressively add white to a colour, which effectively makes it lighter. Now a shade is the opposite of that. It's effectively adding black to a colour until the colour becomes darker. And then you have a tone. Now a tone focuses in the centre from the grey, and it's directly adding grey to a colour until it appears duller or less vibrant. Now, before we get into directly relating this all to makeup, there's another important thing about classification of colour that we need to discuss. So colours can be classified as cold or warm colours. Now, cold colours are generally have shorter light frequencies, and therefore we tend to perceive them as being calmer or softer. Now the warm colours, they have longer light frequencies which can advance through space, and for that reason we perceive them to be a little bit more vibrant or energetic. Now it's really important to understand them too when we're moving forward to the next part and talking about relation to colour theory when it comes to skin tone. So we have warm and cold colours as well. So let's keep that in mind as we advance forward. So for classification, our cold colours are our blues, our violets, our greens, and most of our greys. And then our warmer colours are the reds, yellows, browns, and tans. Now, it's really important to understand that when it comes to colour matching for the skin, complementary colours, and layering pigments to achieve a believable cosmetic camouflage. So let's keep that in mind as well. So let's relate that directly to skin. First of all, we have skin tone. Now, skin tone is the predominant colour that you see when you look at somebody. The first initial impact that you have when you look at somebody at a glance is sometimes known as the complexion. And our skin tone is directly affected by melanin. Now, melanin are dark pigments that we all have within our skin, and the amount of melanin in which your skin carries determines how light or dark your skin is, and your eye colour and your hair colour. Then we have something called undertone. Now, this is when a lot of people tend to get a little bit more confused. Now, undertone are the muted colours that we see beneath the surface of our skin. And they're not affected by any external elements like lighting or tanning or anything else. Your undertones will always remain the same. So now we understand that, let's go a little bit further. So it's really important to understand undertone and determine what undertone somebody is before we start approaching things like colour matching, because it's directly going to have an impact on which kind of colour you choose for them. So how do we determine it? One of the easiest ways is to look at the wrist, and in our wrist we can generally see our veins underneath the surface of our skin. Now, our veins will give us a good indication as to what kind of undertone we are. So if you've got more blue-purple appearance in your veins, you're generally more of a cooler undertone. If you've got a blue-green undertone within your veins, then it's what's classified as neutral. And then if you have more of a green or olive kind of appearance to your veins, then you're generally classified as a warmer undertone. Now, this can be quite confusing. Another one of the ways that you can quickly identify if somebody is cool, neutral, or warm is by looking at their choice of jewellery. So generally, when you put gold onto somebody's skin, it complements warmer skin tones. If somebody's wearing silver, it's generally a suggestion that they have a cooler undertone, because silver will more complement a colder complexion and gold will more complement a warmer complexion. So that's one of the ways you can look at your client and see what kind of jewellery they wear. That can really help you in determining what undertone they are. Now, there's a common misconception that those that have fairer skins are generally cooler undertones, and those that have more darker, richer skin tones are generally warmer undertones. Now, this isn't always the case. You can have a cooler undertone and still have fair skin, or you can have a warmer undertone and have fair skin, and vice versa when it comes to darker skins. So this is why sometimes when you look at a foundation in the palette and it appears like it would match your client and you put it onto their skin, sometimes it can go really dull and grey and ashy, or it can appear really orange or really yellow. It's because you're misjudging the undertone. So it's really important to identify undertone, and then we can understand what kind of foundation is going to be more suited for that particular person. So when it comes to skin tone and the colour wheel, no matter what ethnicity or how light or dark your skin is, everybody's skin tone will be found between the yellow-orange and the red section. So all skin tones will be found within that. But where do we find them within that spectrum? So if we imagine our globe again spinning on the axis, if you look, for example, at colder or cooler undertones, people are going to be found more towards the red-purple area of that wheel. Now, if we look at warmer undertones, they're coming round more towards the yellow. But what about when we look at darker or really lighter skin tones? When we look at the darker skin tones, they're still within the yellow-orange to red, but they move into the shade section. So they'll be travelling through that other spectrum. And then likewise with really fair or paler skins, they're still within yellow, orange and red, but they move up the tint scale, so they're going more towards the white. So they're all found within the same classifications on the colour wheel between the yellow, orange and the red, but they will move up the shades or up the tint section as well. Now, skin tone also varies in brightness or dullness, which is why you can always find skin tones as well that move around the hues, but also through that tone section out and in towards the grayscale. So always within yellow, orange to red, but our skin tones can be found through the tone, tint or shade section. And that's for everybody. Now, as we know, it's commonplace within makeup artistry to use colour corrections to achieve a balanced skin tone across the face and the body. And this could be when it comes to things like dark circles or rosacea, hyperpigmentation, vitiligo, tattoos, basically anything that is in contrast to the skin tone. So we use corrector tones in that, and that's when we come to our complementary colours. Now, this is fundamental to understand when it comes to cosmetic camouflage. So we discussed that complementary colours are always found opposite each other on the colour wheel. Now, with that exact theory in mind, we're going to approach the next part of this colour theory understanding. So with that knowledge, all we need to do is identify what colour the discoloration is on the skin, and then we'll be able to directly look at our colour wheel and identify what is opposite that, and therefore that would be our complementary colour to help neutralise the pigment and give us a balanced skin tone. Now, pictured here is the colour wheel and also our concealer circle in neutraliser. Now, you'll see within this concealer circle, you have all of the complementary colours you would need to be able to correct something on somebody's skin tone. So all we now have to do is identify what colour the discoloration is, and therefore we can find that on our colour wheel and see which of these neutraliser colours are going to help us to achieve a cosmetic camouflage. Now, we've also got in there a paler tone. That's for neutralising the saturation of colour. So if you don't want the vibrancy of a particular colour, then you can reduce that, and that's when we're kind of coming up and down our tint section. You can also use your other concealers within your palettes, and you can mix these corrector tones in with them, and that will take us up and down the tone and the shades and the tint section as well. So we can effectively change these corrector colours so that they are the exact saturation needed to be able to effectively cover the pigment within that person's skin. Another really important element when it comes to colour theory and makeup is light. Light plays a really crucial role in how we perceive something. So it's important to understand how light affects our skin when we're wearing makeup and when we're not. These two different contrasts can really make a difference when it comes to making a believable camouflage or making somebody's skin look natural and fresh even when they're wearing makeup. So this model here will describe how light affects the skin when we're not wearing any makeup. So irrelevant of the light source, the skin will only actually reflect 4 to 7% of the light source. The rest of it is absorbed and it hits the underlying dermis, and then it reflects back out from the skin in multiple directions, so it achieves a diffused impression. This basically is what allows us to see the kind of transparency in skin, because we're visibly seeing the reflection on the surface, and then we identify that as the surface layer of the skin, and then the light that's being diffused as it exits the skin in different ways gives us that ability to be able to see deeper into the skin, giving us that transparent impression, and also allows us to be able to see things like veins and our undertones. So this is what gives our skin its natural impression, when it has that kind of illusion of shine, but still has that kind of transparency to it as well. So how does that differ when it comes to us wearing makeup? Well, specifically with cosmetic camouflage or full coverage foundations, they tend to have a lot higher pigment in them. So what happens when we're trying to achieve a cosmetic camouflage is we layer these pigments onto the surface of the skin, and then when we're using things like translucent powder and various other products on top, basically what happens when the light hits the surface of the skin is it reflects 100% of the light instead of absorbing any of it. This is when makeup can look really cakey, or it appears very, very heavy, and we don't achieve that kind of natural appearance of skin anymore. And that's when we lose that illusion of a cosmetic camouflage. For a cosmetic camouflage, we really want the skin to look like it's natural, like there's no kind of thick layers of anything on the surface. So how do we achieve this when we know we need to use these highly pigmented concealers and foundations, but we still want the skin to look natural? The answer is to utilize our color theory. So when approaching a cosmetic camouflage, there's various different ways it can be done. Sometimes, depending on the intensity of pigment, like for example, sometimes with very, very dark tattoos, it would be advisable to use a color corrector or a complementary color and layer it initially onto the skin, then powder it and then layer the skin tone. Because sometimes you need that intensity of colour in order to correct the pigment within the skin. However, other times we can get away with mixing the complementary colour in with a neutralizer or in with a foundation, so we're bringing it more towards the natural skin tone immediately while we're correcting the colour. And this has to be done on a one-to-one basis. It has to be done on analysis of each individual client. For example, you working on the face and you're working on the finer areas of skin, like around the eye, you wouldn't want to use a full saturation of colour here. A, because the skin is more transparent, but also because the skin is thinner. So the more layers we build up, we lose that illusion of camouflage because you're starting to see the cakiness and the makeup sitting into the lines. So this is when it comes to utilising our colour theory. Mixing a complementary colour in with our foundation is bringing that correction more towards the skin tone in the first initial step, and we're seeing them kind of different undertones coming through. So when light hits the skin, we still believe that it has that transparency because we're seeing the undertones already within the concealer that we've used to hide and conceal the pigmentation or the blemish. So it's about layering and keeping as fine layers as you possibly can. That's one thing that will help you achieve a believable camouflage. And the other thing is the illusion of light. So we can always introduce other products that give that kind of luminous effect that it has when we don't wear makeup and light hits the skin. So we can use other products to bring back that idea of transparency along with our complementary corrector colours and achieve a good cosmetic camouflage. So let's put that theory into practice. Let's do an exercise together. So we have some images here of dark circles underneath the eye on varying different skin tones. Now we can visibly see that all of the dark circles are darker than the individual skin tone. However, it's going to take varying degrees and different colours of corrector or complementary colours in order to achieve their person's natural skin tone and give a believable impression of a cosmetic camouflage. Now, I'm going to put on here the Concealer Circle Neutralizer, and I want you guys to take a moment and actually analyse the person's skin tone and look at the colours that you can see within the pigmentation of the dark circles, and then you decide which of these complementary colours would you select in order to correct the dark pigmentation that we can see underneath the eyes. So we're just going to give you a moment to look at each of them and then jot down on a piece of paper what colours you would be looking to use in order to effectively correct that pigmentation. So in the first example, we've identified that the skin tone is neutral with a cool undertone. So when we look at the dark circles, we can see that they're predominantly blue, but have hints of green in there as well. So the colours that we've selected from the Concealer Circle to correct this are the X30, which is the bright orange, and the X406, which is the neutralizer. Now we've mixed equal amounts of these in order to bring it closer to the example skin tone. And then we've added a little bit of X32, which is that salmon red, to help counteract the green tones within the dark circle, but also to give them slight little flecks of colour that we see in the natural undertone. So the mix of these three together would actually effectively create a perfect camouflage for this skin tone. So in the second example, we identified that the skin is more of a yellow tone and it has a warm undertone. So the dark circles themselves are kind of like a blue-green in equal contrast. So how we decided to approach this was to start with the X406 because we don't want the fairness of the skin to be too much warmed by the brightness of the concealer colours. So we've gone for X406 to bring it closer to the paleness of the natural skin tone. Then we've used the X Yellow in order to give it that undertone that we see within the skin. and the X30, the bright orange, to actually counteract that kind of blue-green in the actual dark circles. So the combination of these three tones again brings it closer to the example's natural skin tone, and then the corrector tones are in there to help neutralize the pigment, but without warming the skin too much. This again would achieve a really believable cosmetic camouflage. And in the third example, we identified that there's a lot of pink in the skin tone and it has a cool undertone. So we need to be really careful when it comes to selecting the corrector color, or the complementary color in this case. The dark circles themselves have a blue-purple undertone to them. So we want to be able to correct that pigmentation, but without making it too bright for the fairness of the natural skin. So we start with the X406 and introduce half of the concentration of the X406 in the X32, that real pinky salmon color. So this is giving the skin tone its natural undertones that we see within the skin, while also helping to correct some of that kind of blue undertone in the dark circle. Then a very small amount of the X32, the brighter orange, and that's just going to help to balance that real purpley undertone that we see in them dark circles on that particular example there as well. So the contrast of these three colors together are going to bring it closer to the example's natural skin tone, while effectively achieving a camouflage. Now, with this theory understood, you should now be able to approach any type of color correction in the skin and effectively achieve a camouflage. It's just about identifying the undertones and the skin tone of the client, and then identifying the undertones of the actual pigmentation itself. And then using your color wheel, you can determine the kind of colors that are going to be useful and your complementary colors that will help to correct and conceal, so that you achieve a cosmetic camouflage. We measure color temperature in what's known as the Kelvin scale. So that's the temperature of light. And this particular image was originally shot in around 4,200 Kelvin with an electronic flash. And what's really interesting is to see the effect of what the Kelvin scale does as we move up towards the more natural blue tones and as we move down towards the warmer tones. Now, what we can see here, as we move up towards natural daylight that has more of the kind of blue undertones, you can see that the blue light is actively correcting the orange and the warmth within the makeups. We're actually seeing color correction happen between the light and physical color. We know that on our color wheel, our oranges and our yellows and our warm tones are opposite our blue tones. So that's what the light is doing to the makeup. It's basically cancelling out that warmth. It's cancelling out the oranges and the reds and the warmth that we see within the skin. And it makes it more stark and quite often a little bit more unflattering to showcase the face in this kind of way. On the other part of the scale, as we move more towards the warmer tones, you can see that the warmth within the makeup actually intensifies, because now what we're doing is adding warm onto warm. So basically we're creating a higher saturation of color, and therefore the makeup appears a lot warmer and the tones become a lot more intensive. And this is kind of representative within candlelight. We all know that candlelight is quite romantic. Everybody looks great in candlelight because it adds that kind of warmth to the skin, and you have the beautiful shadows, and generally it showcases people in their best light. So it's really interesting to see exactly how light temperature affects our makeups as well. So it's a really important thing to consider when you're doing makeups. What kind of light is it going to be visible in? So if it is going to be in cool lighting or blue undertone lighting, do you need to put more warmth into the makeup in order to counteract that? And likewise, if it's going to be shot in something that has the more towards the red undertones in the temperature of the light, do you need to kind of maybe pull it back a little bit so that it doesn't appear too hot or too red under that particular type of lighting? The best practice, wherever possible, is to apply your makeup in natural daylight. Natural daylight gives us the full spectrum of colour, and it's evenly diffused and it's clear. So it will always showcase makeup in its natural state. If a colour match isn't perfect, you'll notice it much more in natural daylight than you would in artificial light. If something needs more blending, again, it would be highlighted more in natural daylight than it would in artificial light. So it basically allows us to be able to balance the makeup exactly how we want it to be represented on camera or on film or one-to-one inside a room that has artificial lighting. So doing your makeup in natural daylight is always going to be the best, because no matter what lighting it goes into, it's still going to have a true representation of how you wanted it to kind of appear. So natural daylight is always a winner when it comes to working in makeup. There is so much to understand when it comes to colour theory and the other elements like colour temperature and lighting and the effect that that has. But it really is something that is fundamental to mastering makeup and cosmetic camouflage. So a full knowledge of understanding of colour theory is something that we advise everybody should educate themselves with. And practice makes perfect. The more and the longer that you work with corrector colours and lighting, the easier it will become to understand. We hope this video was helpful for you, and please drop us a comment if there's anything that you don't understand, and we'll get back to you and try to explain it in more detail. And if there's other videos that you feel like might be helpful, then please give us a comment and we can look at maybe creating more of these educational videos for you in the future. Thanks very much for watching.